Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are made by everyone that is involved to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at thefortunesociety.soc. Today's show is entitled Putting an End to Today's Public Safety Crises. As we think about the public safety crises in this country and in this city and in the state of New York, according to the former mayor of Ithaca, New York, mass incarceration, crime rates, and transforming public safety are all interrelated. In Ithaca, according to someone we're going to be joining us really soon, we prove public safety reform is possible, not by adding more police, but by investing in social services, which genuinely improve people's lives, says Svante Myrick, who was elected to his post at the age of 24 as the mayor of Ithaca. In this episode, our guest is none other than Svante Myrick, who is now president and CEO of People for the American Way, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit progressive advocacy group founded by TV producer Norman Lear of All in the Family. PFAW, or People for the American Way, had put out a recent report, All Safe, Transforming Public Safety, which focuses on the 3 steps public officials need to take to end today's public safety crises. Svante Myrick, thanks so much for joining us today here at Both Sides of the Bars. How are you feeling?
Feel great. Absolutely thrilled to be here with you. Really appreciate you having me on. And it's an important topic. I'm really happy to dive into it with you today.
Absolutely. And we've had you on before when you were in your former role as mayor of Ithaca, and you really gave us some really enlightening thoughts to focus on and obviously think about. And we appreciate that. And now you're in a new role, right? Yeah. Leading an organization in D.C., focusing on public safety, which is great. And so we want to hear about that. And so I think we'll jump right into it, Svante. And, as I think I'm used to calling you Mr. Mayor, but as you think about Svante, right, there's legislation that's pending in New York State, right, including clean slate legislation, which is teetering on being passed, right? Also bail reform that Governor Hochul is trying to roll back. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that current legislation that's pending, and from your vantage point. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, sure. What the state of play is. Well, so there's clean slate legislation that actually already passed. It just hasn't been signed into law. This legislation passed the Assembly, it passed the Senate, and just waiting for the governor's signature. And what that does is it wipes clean. It's pretty well named. It's a clean slate for folks who've had misdemeanors or certain felonies. After 3 years for misdemeanors, after 8 years for certain felonies, 8 years after your release, the state will wipe away those records. They will hide those records so that folks can have a shot at employment mostly. That's the biggest reason why you would do this. That is a great step forward. New York State is not a leader in criminal justice reform. It should be. We can get into that, but it is not and has not been for a while. It's had some pretty backwards policies. Even the bail reform, which was a positive step forward, has now been undermined repeatedly using what I think is some pretty junky data to undermine it. And so we are at a real inflection point here in New York State. We are having to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what is the point of this criminal justice system? If the point of the criminal justice system is to punish people that we don't like, punish people that we have deemed are bad, we want to continue to punish them well after they get out of prison, we want to punish them for the rest of their lives for a crime that they committed. Well, that's one thing. That's sort of the system we have now. If we want to rehabilitate people, that is to say, if we want to build better citizens, if we want to build folks who are less likely to hurt other people, if we want to build people who are more likely to have gainful employment, become tax-paying citizens, to contribute to society, well, then we should urge the governor to sign the Clean Slate bill, and we should urge our entire state government to stand firm on bail reform. And we can get into the details of these if you'd like, but that's basically where we are right now. It's going to be a very important year in New York state government as it comes to criminal justice reform.
Now, all of these efforts, Svante, obviously speaks to this notion of mass incarceration, right? Our need, obviously, to end that. Like, what are your thoughts on like ending mass incarceration? Because it's truly significant, right? And I know we'll go into a little more discussion about the historical things that play into and that's fed that idea and the experience of mass incarceration. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think we just got to keep an eye on the ball here. Like, what is the point of incarcerating people? Well, if the point is to reduce crime and to make our streets safer, we should be honest that this has been a multi-trillion-dollar effort that has failed. People who become incarcerated are more likely to commit crimes post-release, even when adjusted for all other factors. So you got to ask yourself, is mass incarceration actually working? Is it rehabilitating people? Would we continue a diet, right, if it had the opposite effects? If you told your friends, I have this great diet, I've been on it for 3 years, I've gained 35 pounds, I've never felt worse. They would say, well, don't do that diet anymore. It's time to try something different. And here in America, I think it has been tough for us to have that conversation because mass incarceration actually has a couple different goals. And many of those goals remain unstated, right? So you say, okay, well, if mass incarceration isn't making us safer, but it's costing trillions of dollars, why do we do it? Well, is it one, because when we incarcerate somebody in America, we can take away their right to vote? Could be a pretty compelling reason for some politicians to want to continue it. Is it two, because keeping prisons full of people will employ a bunch of folks in politicians' districts, right? Mm-hmm. Creates work, correctional officers, even the construction workers who built the prisons. Maybe. Is it a way to segregate folks, especially black folks, black and brown folks, and get them out of neighborhoods that some powerful politicians don't want them in? Yeah, maybe. So then suddenly you go, okay, so this isn't just a diet that isn't working. This is an intentional plan to weaken, segregate, and separate certain communities. And when you realize that it's actually on good people of all stripes to come together and start to fight back and say, no, it's time to dismantle this thing. It is not working as it's intended. And we can all be safer for it. You mentioned, you're kind enough to mention, I was mayor of Ithaca for 10 years. And over 10 years, our police department shrunk relative to the size of, there's fewer people in it. It wasn't dramatic, maybe 10% fewer people in the police department over that course of 10 years. Our social funding increased, right? 35%. We increased over the course of my tenure, 35% increase in the Ithaca Youth Bureau and the Greater Ithaca Activity Center. We built more affordable housing. We did things like guaranteed income pilot. And over the course of 10 years, guess what happened? Crime went down. Crime went down, not up. And the number of calls that police were sent to also went down. Right? The officers themselves had less to do. Because when you build a society in which people are better taken care of, there's less need for punishment. And I think we can build that in New York State. I think we can build it across the country.
Sure. And as you mentioned that, right, I'm made to reflect on just, how you've kind of engaged your role as mayor in Ithaca, and now by extension, doing this work in DC that you're doing. Talk a little about like repairing today's ineffective justice strategies. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because it's important, right? We have to, I think you've mentioned a couple of them, but do you have any other thoughts on that, Svante, around just like repairing today's ineffective justice system and some strategies?
Yeah. And it starts with, so there's very particular like tactics we can use from ending the war on drugs as we know it. In Ithaca, we created the municipal blueprint called the Blueprint for public health policy around drugs. Other cities, this was the first public call for supervised consumption sites, right, which now are, of course, present in New York City and Seattle, San Francisco, a bunch of other places. We were the first city to say, hey, actually, Suboxone, instead of tightly controlling this thing, we need to make it more freely available, including being able to be purchased in pharmacies with a standing order for prescriptions, and on and on and on, right? Those are like tactics. Same with clean slate. Very, very smart to tell folks, if you pay your debt to society, you can rejoin society. Why is that smart? Because it creates an incentive to rejoin society and a disincentive to continue performing criminal acts. The current system we have now doesn't do that. So why? Those are all strategies, right? Those are all tactics. Those are all things that we should and could talk about and press for passage. But it's going to require first something similar to what they did in South Africa when they successfully pulled down the apartheid regime. It is not just possible to say, hey, we are enlightened now. We know what the answers are. We know what has worked in other cities, other countries. So good news, we can just do it here. In South Africa, they found it necessary to first do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Why? Let's dig into why that is. Why would you need to bother with truth and reconciliation? If you've ever been involved in local government or government at any level, you might suspect why this is because people are not thinking machines. We are not computers. We are actually feeling machines who just happen to think sometimes. And so if you've ever been to a meeting in which you've said, hey, guys, I've got the solution. We're going to put the playground over here. There's 40 people in a gymnasium saying, I wanted my parking lot over there. Or the swing set should be on the east side. And there's feelings, and it's really, really tough. Really tough for people on all sides of this issue to adopt positive, proactive solutions until we've all been honest with ourselves about what got us here in the first place, about that truth and reconciliation. So let me give you an example of this that I think people don't expect. And it had to do with our drug policy. When I released our drug policy in 2014, this was it wasn't yet the height of the opiate epidemic, but we thought it was. We were seeing overdose deaths beginning to spike. Little did we know how far they would go. But in Ithaca, we did better than most places because of this new policy that we adopted, including taking a more humane, what we call harm reduction, right? Syringe exchanges, supervised consumption, more Suboxone, trying to take care of people who are actively using drugs instead of just saying, well, either you're going to die on the street or you're going to come in for rehab, and there's no in-between ground. Tough love. So doing that, we created this, harm reduction pillar. And you know who had a really tough time with this? A lot of us did. I mean, I did. A lot of us did at first. Like, geez, this runs counter to a lot of what we learned. Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Apparently that doesn't work. Turns out it's one of the dumbest slogans involved. I mean, now that I have a 1-year-old boy, no is the first thing kids learn. Kids know how to say no. People know how to say no to things they don't want. We don't have to teach them how to say no. We have to figure out why people are saying yes. And we have to find ways to fulfill and satisfy their needs. But anyway, I'm distracting myself. The point was this. Who had a really hard time with that harm reduction approach to the opiate crisis in 2014? You think, well, maybe the cops are going to hate it. They were actually, the business community, maybe. It was the Black community. Black families in Ithaca who had, I had. So my father, when he was caught up in the crack epidemic of the late 80s, the response to him was not harm reduction. There was not a welcoming and open, here, let us help you approach. It was jail, repeated over and over again. It was a war on drugs. We are going to punish you into submission. And it didn't work. And it didn't work for any of our uncles or mothers or aunts or sisters or brothers. And we all knew that the reason a more humane approach was being considered for the opiate epidemic was because it is an epidemic that had a disproportionately white face. Let's just be honest about that. The face of the opiate epidemic was a white one. And so suddenly there was all this heart-rending soul searching. How do we help these people? There was a portrayal of them as accidental addicts, right? Like with my father, it was like, no, he made bad choices, and that's why he's got to go to jail. But with these kids, no, his shoulder was injured. It's not his fault. He started taking opiates. This could have happened to anybody. Well, the truth is, folks who fall into addiction, no matter what the source, are usually dealing with pain. Physical pain, spiritual pain, or mental pain. That there are very few intentional addicts. Almost all addicts are accidental. Nobody wakes up and says, this is it. I've never done any drugs before, but today is the day I want to throw my life way off, right? So what we had to do in Ithaca, what I had to do, was to sit with these families and hear their stories. I mean, we did actual healing and talking circles. We did actual public sessions. We published people's stories about what happened to their families in the 80s and 90s. And we acknowledged it. We admitted it. We said, yes, the response in the 80s was different than the response now. The response in the 80s was wrong. It should not have happened. We would have been healthier and more successful if we took a different approach. And we will demonstrate compassion to the people who are caught up in this epidemic. And in so doing, create a better society for all of us, right? Because whatever structures we build now are going to be in place when the next epidemic comes down the road. And who knows what the face of that next epidemic is going to look like.
Right.
So what we did was a truth and reconciliation, and it was hard, but it was necessary to get people to adopt these strategies. And I think we haven't yet in New York State done that really so I think the reason bail reform is so controversial is that and forgive me if I'm talking too much, but I there's so much to get in.
Yeah, sure.
The bail reform, people watching may know, New York State said, cash bail is kind of weird. If you have money, you can leave. If you don't have money, you can't. That doesn't have anything to do with your guilt and innocence. That just kind of seems like a two-tiered system of justice in which wealthy people can leave, but poor people are punished for being poor, not for being guilty.
Right.
Makes sense. It made so much sense that those in the know, those who were read in on the issue, agreed to it really fast. Like the state legislature actually moved on it pretty fast. And there wasn't as much public education about why cash bail is an unjust system, right?
Yeah.
And then there was bad timing. There's nothing you can do about the bad timing of the pandemic. When the pandemic happened, crime spiked everywhere, all over red states, blue states, red cities, blue cities. People did bail reform, people didn't. But New York happened to do bail reform right before the pandemic.
Right.
And so in the pandemic, crime went up. In Ithaca, crime went up, right, during the pandemic. And people were like, oh, it's because you defunded the police. We didn't defund the police. Nobody closed any police stations in the pandemic. No police stations closed in the pandemic. They all stayed open all over the country. You know what did close? Community centers, playgrounds, employment centers, daycares. When those things closed, crime spiked, which should give us a clue on what we need to build if we want crime to go down. But anyway, again, I digress. Thing is, with bail reform, because of that bad timing and because we never had a truth and reconciliation process, it has been hard to hold together the political will. And I think the best thing advocates could do right now is to put it on stage, put in the newspaper, get on local TV as many stories as possible about people who have struggled under the crushing weight of a financial burden of a judicial system, of a legal system that had very little to do with their guilt or innocence, and how that extra punishment is cruel and unusual and should not be allowed under the U.S. Constitution.
And when you think about that, Svante, right? Like, you know, this is there's this narrative. Why is the narrative like either or? Like when it comes to policing, like keeping crime rates low and keeping both police officers and the people they serve safe. Why is it an either or kind of narrative?
Yeah. I don't really know, and I think I have a suspicion. When a system is giving you funny outputs, right? Whether this is say you built a factory and all the you're trying to make chairs and all the chairs come out with one leg a little wobbly, or you built a software program and keep spitting out code that doesn't quite make sense. It is always helpful to go back and to take a look at what the system was designed to do. Because what we have right now, I think, is a broad majority of people who want no police abuse, no police violence, and safe streets and good policing. It's like a huge consensus that wants that. So why aren't we getting it? Right? If that's what we want, why aren't we getting it? I think we have to go back and take a look at the machine, how it was built in the first place and why it was built in the first place. And we'll figure out why that chair keeps coming out a little bit wobbly, right? Why is it that officers don't want to be this unpopular? They want their jobs and their lives to be easier and safer. And people want to be able to call a police department and trust that the folks who show up for it are going to be well trained, and they're going to be polite, and they're going to be there fast, and they're going to keep everybody safe. So what is it that makes some communities mistrust it? Was it that a war on drugs was created that was actually not a war on drugs because we didn't prosecute everybody who used drugs? It was just war on certain neighborhoods, on Black neighborhoods, on brown neighborhoods. So we had 4 decades of police officers being sent to prosecute this war on drugs, which caused them to stand on the necks and shoot in the backs our brothers and our uncles and our cousins and our fathers, which caused all sorts of mistrust, still does, because this drug war is still being prosecuted despite its obvious failure.
Right.
The rate of drug use has not changed one iota since we started prosecuting this 40, 45 years ago. And is that a long, painful, difficult history that's built into this machine now, the thing that keeps pushing us into a false narrative? And if we could deconstruct that machine and tell the police, hey, good news, you have very, very little to do with drugs now. Drugs are a health problem. We will have public health professionals beginning to tackle it. And you can go back to make sure nobody's breaking into cars and homes, nobody's shooting each other on the streets, the domestic violence, sexual assault and predation. Those are the things we want you to keep us safe from. Wouldn't we see, right? Can't you close your eyes and picture that city, that community? Wouldn't we see a police force that was more welcomed, trained differently, more accepted? Wouldn't you see less conflict? The very things that are most dangerous both to civilians and police officers are direct outflows of the war on drugs. I'm talking about SWAT raids and unwarranted stops, right? People just pulling over cars. Those things are extremely dangerous. And they have all been done. They've become commonplace in the search to find and root out drugs, which again would, listeners might be like, well, yeah, because drugs are bad. Drugs are bad. Right? So it would be great if all of this cost and all of this violence and all of this blood actually helped the drug problem. It hasn't.
Right. And it's, when you think about it too, Svante, we have a few minutes left because I want to make sure I get to you talking about the release report. But in some communities, particularly Black and brown communities, right, it's been noted that in those communities, right, it's more about law and order. But when you go into communities that may be more affluent, more in fact, by extension, white communities, it's about serve and protect. And that whole dichotomy, right, obviously creates this tension, right, on the one hand with black and brown folk looking at law enforcement a certain way, and white folk on the other hand looking at them a certain way. And that's one of the challenges, right, that speaks to like the war on drugs, like who that the war on, right? Some people maintain the war on black and brown people mostly, although they don't comprise the majority in this country, right, that's using substances, right? So that aside, I want to get into in the last couple of minutes or so that we have left, the People for the American Way that you're now the CEO of, and recently released a report called All Safe, Transforming Public Safety. Like, what is that report all about in about 2 minutes?
Yeah, well, and actually, it's a great segue to this, which is how do you create a police department? I have my friends and family in black neighborhoods go, well, the police aren't here for me.
Right.
They're here for me.
Right.
You understand what I mean?
Yep,
they are sent here by somebody else to surveil me. Right. And in affluent neighborhoods, there's a different feeling. No, the police are here for me. They're here to protect me. That's why they're here. Well, that is all about who is on the force, who leads the force, what were the directions that they were sent, and when they show up, what do they look like? Do they look like the people who live in my community? I'm not just talking about are they black? Are half of them women? If not, why not? Half the people who live in my neighborhood are women. Why aren't half the people on the force? And forces that have more women actually have lower rates of violence, higher rates of crime being solved, and particularly higher rates of sexual crimes being solved. Mm-hmm. So how do you build a better police department? People for the American Way's All Safe report is all about that. How do you remove officers? This is a guide, a blueprint for elected officials to remove officers that are unfit for duty. It is a guide on how to train officers to be better fit for duty. It's a guide for how to deploy your officers so that you can send unarmed professionals to up to 50% of the calls that you send your police department to now. And most importantly, it's how do you recruit better officers in the first place, including using polygraph tests and psychological exams that can screen out the people who are predisposed to bigotry and violence before they're ever allowed on the force in the first place.
Well, this sounds like an amazing report, and certainly people can access. How can people access the report?
Yeah, if you go to peoplefortheamericanway.org, it's a mouthful, so PFAW.org, you'll be able to find the All Safe report. It is 200 pages of the best researched, best peer-reviewed, criminologist-studied blueprint, frankly, on how to build a better public safety system.
Former Mayor of Ithaca, Svante Myrick, and current CEO of the organization People for the American Way. Thank you so much for joining Both Sides of the Bars. And we want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us for this very thought-provoking conversation. And in the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at www.fortunesociety.org. That's www.fortunesociety.org. You can also find us on Facebook by typing in The Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and as always, we appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.